The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD launches July 16th.
Ugh, fine. Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. And in honor of Skyward Sword being re-released, I made a tiny skyloft. This is one of those projects that's been on my to-do list from the very beginning, but I've been putting it off for ages now since I knew that it was going to be a huge undertaking. However, with the remastered version of Skyward Sword finally being released, it felt like maybe it's time to finally tackle this beast. When I made Outset Island from Wind Waker, a number of people pointed me towards NoClip, which is a website that lets you view 3D models from a number of games just in your browser. I used it extensively throughout this project, for better or for worse, as you'll see towards the end. Now to make the template, I just took a top-down screenshot of the island and printed it out so I had a rough shape to chop out, and then I kept it on my computer screen while I worked so I could get the general shape of the island transferred onto the foam. Now when you do take a screenshot from the top-down position, it is slightly fisheyed, so it's not going to be a perfect one-to-one of the island, but that's okay because I lack the skills to make it a perfect one-to-one, so it's going to be like a 1-to-4, we'll call it. So up until this point, I've just been blocking out the rocky parts along the bottom, and now I'm just going to start refining the top. This was a very slow and tedious process as I tried to carve as much detail into the foam as I possibly could, while simultaneously flying around the 3D model and trying to gauge size and shapes relative to one another. All the houses are built into the landscape, so I'm also going to try and carve the houses out of the foam rather than add them in as separate buildings. Then the final step before priming will be texturing the rocks, and to add a nice rock texture, rocks. And then I'm ready to turn to gap filler. I use gap filler to fill in a lot of the recesses left between the different sheets of foam, and it can also be used to strategically hide the results of trying to cut fine detail into soft foam using a dull scalpel. Then it's just a case of adding the last few details and we're ready to prime. Gesso has very much been my flavor of the week when it comes to priming things lately, since it goes on thick and works really well with foam, since it fills the barely perceptible holes that mar the surface of XPS foam. So once I've got a nice flat covering over the entirety of all of my pieces, I'm ready to start painting. Now if you know me, you know I love washing rocks. So this is my tried and tested to varying degrees of success method for making quick and easy rock baths. A little matte medium, a little flow improver, a little water, a little bit of Monica, and a couple different inks to create whatever color I'm after. Then you just need to carefully stir it all together, and then it's just as simple as painting it liberally over the surface, making sure that it doesn't pool too much in any one place. The wash will naturally sink into any of the recesses and leave easy highlighting along any of the edges, and I'll also come back through and add little streaks of brown just to give it a bit of variation. But in reality, that is the lion's share of the work done, and we're on to painting the top. I wanted to give the grass the same sort of pixelated color that you might see in the game, so I'm not going to add any flock. Instead, I'm just going to paint all the grassy sections with a light green before stippling a darker green over all of those parts that I've already painted. And the lake bed gets a nice vibrant blue paint job, and I can get started laying down all the little roads and pathways. Then I'm ready to get started on the houses. Now the idea here was to simply paint all the facades onto the rock faces in a vain effort to limit the amount of super fiddly detail work that I would otherwise need to do to go into making these houses. Now whether that try turns into success is very much in the eye of the beholder. Fortunately, I control all the power here, so I'm going to stick with the really blurry, faraway shots for any of the particularly heinous sections. Fortunately, I know when I'm defeated, and trying to carve teeny tiny staircases into foam is beyond my skill, so I'm going to turn to my much beloved clay. I've rolled out some of the thinnest possible sheets of clay I can and then cured them and chopped them down to the required size. Then I can glue them one on top of the other to create the absolutely adorable staircases you see before you now. In a fine example of waste not, want not, I'm also going to use those teeny tiny sheets of clay to make even teenier, tinier little bricks to line all the edges of the grass and around the rim of the island. Now I also made a few of the other landings and steps out of clay, since uniformity is the spice of life. Then I can get to work on the wooden planks, jumping platforms, and other little bits and pieces. Now every single piece of wood you see in this project comes by way of stir sticks, so let this serve as proof that by using simple household products, you can create some truly mediocre works of art. Now I might be crazy, but I ain't crazy enough to try and lay down 100 itty-bitty bricks to make the tiled sections of the floor. Instead, I'm going to score some messy tiles into the foam and use a little gray dry brush to highlight the tops. This works really well since it needs to look pretty mossy and overgrown anyways, so only highlighting the top will help to achieve that look with minimal effort. After all, easy effects with minimal effort is my spirit animal. Now the stir sticks are a bit too obviously stir sticky, so we can fix that with a little bit of brown paint. I've also added some planks of wood around some of the choice parts of the houses, so I'll make sure to paint them as well before moving on to making my fences. To make my fences, I need my stir sticks to be a lot smaller. So I'll chop them lengthwise until they're the size of an atom, and then I'll split those in half and see what's inside. Then using a little bit of painter's tape, a little bit of super glue, and an awful lot of patience, I've got some pretty terrific little fences to add onto the island. Now, I call these fences, but they're very multifunctional as they also serve as the railings on the decks and jumping platforms. And then once I've got them all in place, I'll give them that same dark brown paint that I did with all the other wooden sections. Of course, while the top section is going to get a lot of the love, it's of equal importance to make sure that Batro's house underneath the island is easily accessible as well. I knew from the outset that I wanted the island to be flying. Unfortunately, levitation is outside my skill set for the moment. On the other hand, Skyloft has 3 big waterfalls, and I've made flying islands with waterfalls in the past, so I'm gonna cheat a little bit. I've cut some thin sheets of Perspex to fit each of the waterfalls, and I'll use a little 5-minute epoxy to hold them all in place. The waterfalls will act as legs and should be able to hold the weight of the foam island while still being just a part of the original design. That being said, I am going to add a little acrylic rod underneath the bazaar to help support the weight for when I add that second island. And then that small island on top gets the same waterfall treatment and is going to get held in place using a little bit of UV resin. Now before I pour my resin lake, I need to add that tiny windmill which I made out of foam and a toothpick. Now the end result looks halfway decent, but it turned out to be kind of a bad idea since the UV resin gets hot enough to melt the foam, and I was left with a pretty wonky, slightly melty looking foam building. In a perfect world, this wouldn't really be an issue since I could just use normal resin, but I was so far behind schedule for this project that I was defaulting to dumb ideas. Maybe the dumbest of these ideas was to eschew slow set resin in favor of making an entire lake out of UV resin. It ends up being the same as long as you build it up in layers, but it's a lot more finicky process that leaves a lot more room for errors. So then once the UV is set, I'll use the old gloss Mod Podge and straw trick to create some teeny tiny waves on top. Finally, I'll take a little bit of snow flock and mix it onto my gloss Mod Podge, which makes a nice paste that I can apply onto the waterfalls to give both the impression of flowing water as well as hide that gap between the resin and the Perspex sheet. And then I'm on to making the Knights Academy Island. I've seen a lot of incredibly talented artists who make wonderful dioramas and sculptures by carving XPS foam, and I can confidently say that I am not one of them. My goal was to make the Academy out of nothing but foam in a bid to keep it lightweight and make sure that it wasn't going to topple over when I attached it to the main island. However, I was ill prepared for just how much carving fine detail into foam would make me want to break down and cry. In fact, I ended up deciding that at some point I was gonna have to accept mediocrity and hope that a good paint job will add the finer details. If all else fails, I can always do the glamour shot from across the room with the lights turned off. Now, as far as the paint job was concerned, I started with a yellowish stucco base coat before stippling on a little bit of stony gray. I followed the gray with some moldy green to give it that sort of a worn Skyloft look, before adding all the beams and edge highlighting with a nice mustard yellow. Both of the roofs get a nice blue coat, and I'll paint all the wooden beams using the same brown that I colored all the fences and wooden planks with on the other island. Then one of the final stages will be adding all those last little details. The door is going to be a rounded tip of the stir stick, and then the windows will be made of brown squares and semicircles, which then get filled in with a white, yellow, or light blue light. I've also made the little lean-tos on the side of the building, as well as those little rocky sections that teach you how to jump, and that weird little tower on top. And then a little bit of green paint gets stippled around the edge to help blend the building with the rock. Now, it wouldn't be a north of the border video if at some point I didn't make little wormy dealies, which I've baked so that I can chop them down to size. Then these I will painstakingly glue one by one around the edge of the fence in an ill-conceived attempt at making the metal bars along the wall. Now, this took me forever, and they are super flimsy. So by the end of the video, I think I've probably snapped at least 50% of them off already. But ignoring that, we're finished with the Academy Island and we can attach it to the main island. To do this, I'll poke a couple of slots into the space below the gates so that I can jam a stir stick all up in them. Then I'll take the other end of the stir stick and jam that into the corresponding slots on the main island and hope that it doesn't fall over. I made the staircase bridge thing in the same way that I made all the tiny staircases, using really thin sheets of clay, which I will just glue into place between the two islands using the stir sticks as a frame. Then I can add some connection platforms on the top side, and a couple little side panels before gluing teeny tiny newels onto the rail. To help it blend in a little bit better with the islands, I'm going to paint the entire thing with a gray base coat, and then the tops that mustard yellow that you see all over the Academy, before adding some little rupee dots on the side, and then painting the bottom mossy brick green to match everything else. Finally, I'll stip a little bit more of the mossy green all over the stairs and call it done. And we're on to making the main buildings, which are namely the bazaar and the tower. Now at this point I've had just about all I can stomach trying to make things out of foam, so I'm going back to my clay. They'll be sitting on the sturdy island, so I'm not too worried about their weight tipping anything over or being too heavy for the waterfall legs. Once I've got the general shape of the bazaar, it's just a case of adding the details in piece by piece. Now, while I'm doing that, I'd like to take a second to give my newest patrons a big shout out. So a big thank you to Kaylee Hennessy, Moki, The Meatly, Distracted Nobody, and Dana McCarthy. Making these videos is a long and time-consuming process, and it's my patrons that allow me to spend so much time doing it. If you'd like to help me make more of these tiny nerdy things, then please subscribe, hit that like button, leave me a comment, and share this with all of your friends. If you'd like to do a little bit more and buy me a coffee, a sandwich, or a bowl of noodles, well, there's a Patreon tier for that. But with that all said and done, the only thing left to do is give these little buildings a paint job. Now the paint job is loud, colorful, and abrasive in its style, so kind of like me, I guess. At any rate, making all those little foam buildings was beginning to really harsh my vibe, and I was getting more than a little frustrated with the final product. So it is nice to finish with the bazaar since I'm chuffed to bits with the end result, and it's also the centerpiece of the island, so spending a little extra time to make it stand out is probably worth the effort. Alongside the tower, I also made some questionably shaped little windmills and a few tiny chimneys. Then I can glue them all in place with a little bit of super glue, and I can pre-drill a couple little holes which will allow me to glue some snapped off dowel into place, which will function as the tree trunks upon which I shall place my clump foliage. Then using a pin, I'll poke some strategically placed holes so that I can pop some more of these tiny dissected stir sticks into place, which will hold up all of the bunting lines. They'll get painted that exact same dark brown, and then I will do the last little touches for the ground, which are some carpets, and I'll also add little dots of paint to function as sort of flower patches. As with so much of this diorama, the blades of the windmills are going to be made of chopped up stir sticks, and then I'll add that little bird's nest on top using some gnarly twine. And then finally, I can make the lines for the ridiculously small bunting by taking some individual strands of twine and painstakingly winding them around all the posts I just glued into place. Now, let's address the elephant missing from the room. Hey Adam, I hear you say, are you maybe missing an entire island? Well, dear disembodied voice, I'm glad you asked. You see, I spent hours and hours sculpting a truly beautiful and marvelous island upon which to sit my glorious goddess statue. However, and spoilers here, I had to detach it and drop it from the sky in order to destroy the imprisoned for good. So as you can see, it's not just that I completely forgot about it until the last day and realized I didn't have enough time to make it, so my only option was to come up with a very loose but plausible reason as to why it's missing. It was all part of my master plan. But with that out of the way, I'd say we're finished and on to the glamour shots. There you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this one as it nearly killed me. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, then consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and leaving a comment. Let me know what you thought, what you'd like to see next, and what you had for lunch last Saturday. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.